An important aspect of our law is that we believe it's not fair to hold someone accountable for an offense that isn't written down. This could also lead to government abuses. Criminal law is written to be very specific. At the same time, we realize there's bound to be some situations that arise that technically meet the elements of the offense, but that we view as justified and therefore shouldn't be criminal. For this reason, many penal code statutes include specific defenses that allow for some degree of common sense to be inserted. Think of conduct in terms of what is not prohibited, what is prohibited, and the gray area that falls in between. The range of the conduct continuum identifies the range of actions or omissions the written law addresses. In general, the law may specifically mention actions that are not prohibited, or if it doesn't mention them, it's an indicator they are not prohibited. For instance, kicking the back of an airplane seat is not mentioned, so it's not prohibited. The law also specifically mentions actions that are prohibited. For instance, robbing someone with a gun is definitely mentioned in the penal code. Let's look at a more specific example. The age of consent for sexual activity in Texas is 17. A 14-year-old having sex with a 16-year-old is not addressed in the penal code and therefore not prohibited. A 21-year-old having sex with a 16-year-old is prohibited by the statute. An 18-year-old having sex with a 16-year-old is identified as a gray area and addressed with a defense in the statute. An 18-year-old boyfriend having consensual sex with his 16-year-old girlfriend is typically viewed much differently than a 40-year-old having sex with a 16-year-old, and the penal code recognizes that. The defenses in the penal code allow us to hold persons accountable by being very specific with the written law, yet acknowledging there might be some circumstances that are less offensive to community standards. The penal code categorizes 3 different types of gray areas and identifies how each will be resolved. Just as a note, we are speaking about Texas specifically. What we discuss here will likely be different than what might be described in criminal law textbooks, which are written in very general terms. The Texas Penal Code identifies exceptions, defenses, and affirmative defenses that could all be included in specific statutes. Individual penal code offenses may indicate all, some, or none of these categories of defenses in a statute. If they do, they will specify the requirements for that specific offense. Understanding each category is important because the category of defense indicates which side, either the defense or the prosecution, has the burden of proof. First, the penal code identifies exceptions. These are phrased as, it is an exception to the application of. The burden of proof is on the prosecutor to prove the conduct did not fall within any exceptions to prosecution within the specific statute. The defendant would pose his act or omission fell within the gray area of the statute and therefore was not prohibited. The prosecutor must prove it did not. For example, the penal code offense of abandoning or endangering a child states it is an exception to the application of the offense if a parent or guardian voluntarily delivered a child to a designated emergency infant care provider. So a defendant in a case like this, in order to use this exception, would have to pose at trial that he dropped the child off in question at an emergency infant care provider. The prosecutor would have to prove otherwise, and if the prosecution could not do this, the defendant would have to be found not guilty. The next category is defenses. These are written as, it is a defense to prosecution. The burden of proof is on the prosecutor to prove the conduct did not fall within any circumstances when the conduct would be justified. The defendant would pose his act or omission was not prohibited under the statute. The prosecutor must prove it was. For instance, let's say our 18-year-old is a hospital technician who is charged with sexual assault of a 16-year-old for fondling her while she's a patient. The statute indicates that his conduct may be excused if it was part of legitimate medical care. If the defendant wanted to use this defense, he would have to pose his acts were part of medical care, and the prosecutor would have to prove they were not. If for some reason the prosecutor could not prove that his acts were not part of medical care, the defendant would have to be found not guilty. Finally, affirmative defenses. These are phrased as, it is an affirmative defense to prosecution. The burden of proof is on the defense to prove the conduct which would have otherwise been criminal was not criminal under the particular circumstances. The prosecutor would pose the act or omission was prohibited. The defendant must prove it was not. Let's say our 18-year-old is charged with sexual assault for having intercourse with his 16-year-old girlfriend during a consensual encounter. There is an affirmative defense available to him that states his conduct may be excused if there was less than 3 years age difference between the two. This is commonly called the Romeo and Juliet defense. The 18-year-old defendant must prove there was less than 3 years difference between the two. If the defendant was able to do that, he would have to be found not guilty.